Welcome to Sleepcast, probably the most boring podcast in the world. Sleepcast is created to help you relax, slow down, and gently drift off to sleep. There's nothing you need to remember and nowhere else you need to be. Simply get comfortable, close your eyes, and allow tonight's quiet story to carry you away. And now, we hand things over to our two hosts for today's episode. Rest well and enjoy.
Imagine a massive machine, right? Like a machine pulling so incredibly hard against its own staggering weight that it just violently rips its own steel coupling lungs completely out.
Yeah, literally right out of the socket.
Exactly. That is what happens when you unleash, 120,000 pounds of tractive effort incorrectly on a heavy freight train. You get this massive, catastrophic failure.
And in the rail yards, they actually call that jerking a lung, which is just
such a visceral term.
It really is. It paints quite a picture.
It does. And today we're tearing down this romanticized, clean-cut idea of the railroad. Because I think we usually look at modern infrastructure like a skyscraper or, a highway, and we just assume it was designed perfectly from a clean blueprint from day one.
Right. Like you pour the concrete, stack the steel, and boom, there it is.
Right. But the global railway system, it is not a clean blueprint, not at all. It's this murky, almost living organism that had to violently mutate just to survive across 3 different centuries.
It really is the ultimate evolutionary survival story of the industrial age. I mean, you were looking at a system that constantly faced existential threats, geographical, economic, mechanical, and now environmental. And it had to fundamentally rewire its own anatomy to stay alive.
Well, welcome to the Deep Dive. We are so thrilled to have you with us today because our mission is to explore this really fascinating stack of historical and engineering records, and they detail the sheer unpredictable evolution of the railroad.
It's a wild ride.
It really is. We are going to look at how we went from a completely disconnected, untamed wilderness to a shrinking continent. And then we'll examine how one visionary tried to build a literal, highly surveilled utopia for his rail workers.
And exactly what happened when that grand dream collided with economic reality.
Spoiler alert, it didn't go well. We're also going to pop the hood and see how the massive machines pulling these trains completely changed their hearts and lungs, swapping out coal and steam for diesel and electric power.
And finally, we will look at how those exact same heavy iron rails are quietly becoming an invisible digital network today.
So if you are wondering why this specific journey matters to you, whether you actually ride trains or not, it's because the railroad isn't just about moving freight. It is the story of the birth of the modern connected world that you live in.
Absolutely. I mean, it's about the physical shaping of nations, drawing absolute lines on maps that dictated where entire cities would rise and fall. It represents that massive leap from analog brute force to digital precision.
Right. When you understand how the railroad evolved, you understand how modern commerce, timekeeping, and even modern corporate culture were actually forged.
So true.
Let's start with the absolute friction of geography, right? Shrinking the continent, the first transcontinental railroad. And this wasn't an inevitable thing.
No, not at all.
It started as an incredibly wild, almost laughable idea. Like back in 1847, Dr. Hartwell Carver submitted a formal proposal to the U.S. Congress asking for a charter to build a railroad from Lake Michigan all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
Which was just nuts at the time.
It was. To put that into perspective for you, at this time, the West was broadly referred to on maps and in the public consciousness as the Great American Desert.
Yeah, it was considered impassable. Just this empty void, completely unsuited for something as delicate and, well, industrial as a continuous railroad track.
It was a massive conceptual leap.
You really have to remember the mindset of the 1840s and 1850s. Crossing the continent was a matter of months. It was fraught with extreme danger, disease, and geographic barriers that felt completely insurmountable.
Right. A wagon train was an exercise in pure survival.
Exactly. But Carver's proposal, it planted a political seed. Congress didn't immediately hand him a shovel, obviously, but it led directly to the Pacific Railroad surveys, which were conducted between 1853 and 1855.
And the scale of what they accomplished during those surveys is just staggering.
Truly staggering.
They were directed by the Department of War, right?
Yes. Jefferson Davis, who was the Secretary of War at the time, directed them. They sent out these massive expeditions of soldiers, engineers, and scientists, and they mapped over 400,000 square miles of territory.
400,000 square miles on foot and horseback.
Yeah. And they weren't just looking for places to lay track either. They were cataloging the natural history, the flora, the fauna, reptiles, mammals. They were treating this like an expedition to a foreign planet,
Yeah.
just trying to understand this alien landscape to see if industrial civilization could even survive there.
The logistics of just keeping those survey teams alive out there must have been an absolute nightmare.
It was grueling work, but the data they brought back was pivotal. They charted multiple potential paths, but geographically speaking, the surveys determined that the absolute best route lay far to the south, below the Gila River.
Because the terrain there was mostly vacant, flat desert.
Right. And if you were building a railroad, you want flat. You desperately want to avoid blasting through solid granite mountains if you can help it.
But there is a massive geopolitical catch here.
A huge catch. That theoretically ideal route was actually south of the border. It was located entirely in Mexico.
Wow.
So the findings of this railroad survey directly motivated the United States government to make the Gadsden Purchase from Mexico in 1853. They paid $10 million for nearly 30,000 square miles of land just to secure the physical space for a potential rail route.
That is just wild. The need for a flat grade was so overwhelming, they literally bought a piece of another country.
Infrastructure redrawing the international border.
But knowing the best route and getting politicians to actually agree on it are two very different things, as always. The congressional debate over where the eastern terminus should be was incredibly intense.
Very intense. They had 3 main proposed routes on the table, and each had massive glaring flaws.
Right. First, you had the Northern Rook, which would run along the Missouri River through present-day Montana to the Oregon Territory.
And that was quickly deemed completely impractical, because the engineering challenge wasn't just laying the track, it was keeping it operational.
Because of the snow.
Exactly. A railroad paralyzed by horrific winter snows and avalanches in rough mountainous terrain for half the year is essentially a useless asset.
Okay, then you had the Southern Route, going through Texas and New Mexico to Los Angeles. As you mentioned, geographically, this was the easiest path, but politically, absolute non-starter.
Right, because the country was careening rapidly toward the Civil War.
Yeah, the northern states, which held significant political and financial power, were absolutely not about to hand the economic engine of a transcontinental railroad to the southern states.
Which leaves the inevitable compromise, the Central Route.
Ah, the middle ground.
Literally. This path followed the Platte River in Nebraska through to South Pass in Wyoming, essentially mirroring a large portion of the old Oregon Trail.
It wasn't perfect, though.
No, not at all. Winter snows in the Sierra Nevada mountains were still a massive, deadly concern. But politically and geographically, when you're balancing the tensions of a fracturing nation, it was the only viable path forward.
So the political friction is resolved, but now they face the physical friction. The sheer feat of building this continuous line is hard to wrap your head around today.
It really is.
You had 3 private companies tasked with building it, heavily fueled by massive U.S. land grants and government subsidy bonds.
And the scale of human labor required is just monumental. The Central Pacific Railroad Company of California took on arguably the most grueling physical task.
Building east from Sacramento?
Yes, and they had to fight their way through the solid granite peaks of the Sierra Nevada. I mean, they were literally hanging laborers off the sides of cliffs in woven baskets to hand-drill holes for black powder explosives.
That is terrifying.
It is. But despite that, they managed to carve out and lay 690 miles of track.
Meanwhile, the Union Pacific Railroad is building westward from Omaha and Council Bluffs. They laid a staggering 1,085 miles of track across the sprawling plains and then up through the Rocky Mountains.
And we shouldn't leave out the Western Pacific Railroad, which added a crucial 132-mile final leg from Alameda and Oakland to connect with Sacramento.
Over 1,900 miles of continuous track, laid primarily by hand. Irish immigrants in the East, Chinese immigrants in the West, working under brutal, often lethal conditions.
Yeah, the human cost was immense.
It was, and it all culminated in that incredibly cinematic moment on May 10th, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, the last spike ceremony.
The tracks from the east and the tracks from the west finally meet.
Right. Leland Stanford, the president of the Central Pacific, stands there with a silver hammer and ceremonially taps in a golden spike to finish the job. It's one of those moments in history that feels almost mythical, like a movie ending.
But beyond the gold spike and the telegraph sent around the world, what did this physical connection actually achieve?
Yeah, what was the immediate economic reality for a regular person?
Well, the economic reality was arguably one of the most profound shifts in human history. We talked about the friction of geography. Before the railroad, if you wanted to move massive amounts of goods or people across the country, it took months.
Months of brutal travel.
Yes. Suddenly, it took days, and the cost plummeted to roughly 1/10 of what it had been with a stagecoach or wagon transport.
It's hard to visualize that kind of economic shift today.
Think about an individual farmer in the Midwest. If that farmer wanted to ship a heavy load of corn just 200 miles to a market in Chicago by wagon, the cost of feeding the horses, the time spent, and the sheer effort of the transportation would actually exceed the market price of the corn.
Wow, so selling the corn at a distance was just a net loss.
Exactly. You were completely geographically trapped. If you couldn't sell it locally, it rotted. Economic activity was heavily inhibited by the friction of distance.
But overnight, that changes.
Overnight, that same farmer could load his corn onto a freight train, ship it 200 miles, and turn a healthy profit. That great American desert, which was considered this useless, impassable void, transformed into the American breadbasket in the span of just 30 years.
Mining, ranching, and farming suddenly became highly profitable, scalable enterprises.
All because the physical barrier of distance was virtually eliminated.
It's exactly like the shift from dial-up internet to broadband.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right, because with dial-up, you could send a tiny bit of text, but it took forever, it was expensive, and you would never try to send a massive file because the connection would inevitably drop. You're fundamentally isolated by the technology.
Yeah, the bandwidth just wasn't there.
But the moment broadband hit, the constraints vanished. Nodes that were completely isolated were suddenly, permanently, and continuously connected. Huge packets of data, or in the 1870s, huge packets of grain and livestock could move instantly. It permanently altered the economy of the American West.
It is a perfect parallel. The infrastructure dictated what was economically possible. But of course, evolution never stops.
No, it doesn't.
Once you lay the tracks and prove that you can move people across a continent in days, a new friction emerges.
Right. You've solved the friction of distance, but you haven't solved the friction of comfort. Because when you put a human being in a wooden box behind a massive, belching steam engine for 6 straight days, the friction isn't geographic anymore. It's intensely physical and psychological.
Those early cross-country trains were cramped, they were freezing at night, sweltering in the day, and just coated in soot.
Which brings us to the question of experience. How do you make someone actually want to travel this way?
And that leads us to a man who looked at that physical misery and saw a massive business opportunity. George Pullman.
Pullman. His background is entirely fascinating because he wasn't some railroad aristocrat who inherited a train empire.
Not at all. He was deeply rooted in raw mechanical problem solving.
He dropped out of school at 14, didn't he?
Yes, he dropped out of New York and went to work on the Erie Canal with his father. Their job was literally to physically move houses out of the way of the widening canal.
Just picking up houses.
Yeah. He learned the brute mechanics of lifting heavy structures, and eventually he ended up in Chicago, a city that had a massive, frankly disgusting problem at the time.
The mud.
Worse than mud. Chicago was essentially built on a bog, slightly above the water level of Lake Michigan. They desperately needed a modern sewage system to stop the spread of cholera, but they couldn't install underground pipes because there was no underground.
So what do you do?
They had to raise the entire street level of the city by several feet.
Which sounds architecturally impossible without tearing everything down.
It does, but Pullman took the skills he learned moving houses on the canal and devised a mechanical system using thousands of jack screws.
Wow.
He hired armies of men to turn these screws in unison, physically jacking up Chicago's massive brick buildings, hotels, and entire city blocks out of the muck, raising them to a new grade level so the sewers could go in underneath. He literally lifted the city.
That sheer mechanical ingenuity made him his first fortune. And then He turned that same exact problem-solving mindset toward the misery of rail travel. He looked at these awful, bone-rattling train cars and thought, I can engineer a solution to human discomfort.
And he did. In 1864, he built the first Pullman sleeping car. He called it the Pioneer.
But what's interesting is that it was initially a massive commercial failure.
Oh, complete failure.
Yeah.
It was entirely too expensive and far too opulent for the standard railroad companies of the day. I mean, the beds folded down from the ceiling, the upholstery was rich, the woodwork was intricate.
It was a rolling palace.
Exactly. And nobody wanted to pay for it.
It actually took a national tragedy to act as a marketing campaign.
Yes, unfortunately.
Following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the Pioneer was selected to be part of the funeral train cortege taking the president's body back to Springfield, Illinois. And because of the incredible national attention on that train, the whole country suddenly saw this magnificent piece of engineering.
And demand from wealthy travelers skyrocketed overnight. It was a morbid but highly effective masterclass in product placement.
Totally.
However, Pullman's true genius wasn't just in the engineering of the sleeping car. It was in the structural business model he created to support it.
Right, because these hotel cars, parlor cars, and dining cars were wildly expensive to manufacture. The standard railroad companies couldn't afford to buy them outright.
So he didn't sell them.
Right.
Pullman leased the cars to the railroads, but more importantly, he provided his own highly trained staff to service the passengers. He controlled the hardware, and he controlled the software being the human experience of luxury.
It's worth noting the initial demographics of that workforce, too. In the early days of the company's founding around 1867, it was a mostly white workforce. Now, historically, we know that the Pullman porters later transitioned into a predominantly black workforce that played an absolutely massive role in American civil rights and labor history. But initially, the workforce was composed differently as he built out his service model.
Exactly. And Pullman was obsessed with controlling every single aspect of the passenger's environment, right down to how a porter folded a blanket.
Micromanagement at its finest.
Oh, entirely. And as his manufacturing needs grew exponentially to build these cars, he decided to apply that exact same level of granular control to the lives of the men building them. He didn't just want a factory. He wanted to build a perfectly engineered capitalist utopia.
The ultimate company town.
Yes. The Pullman Palace Car Company bought 4,000 acres of land near Lake Calumet, just south of Chicago. He wanted it to be this beacon of industrial harmony.
So he brings in a prominent architect, Solon Spencer Beman.
Right, who designed the entire town in this beautiful, cohesive Queen Anne style with sweeping Romanesque arches.
And he brought in a landscape architect, Nathan Barrett, who designed curvilinear parks to completely break up the visual monotony you would normally see in a rigid, grid-based industrial city.
For the 1880s, living here must have felt like living in a science fiction novel.
Seriously. I mean, they had indoor plumbing in the houses. They had daily mechanized trash collection in the back alleys. There was a massive brickyard built specifically just to supply the materials for the town itself.
They built the Grand Hotel Florence for visitors. By the fall of 1883, the population had topped 8,000 people.
It was a thriving hub of highly skilled immigrant laborers from Scandinavia, Germany, England, and Ireland. If you compare that to the squalid slums of a standard 19th century industrial city, on paper, it sounds like absolute paradise.
It was meticulously designed to look like paradise.
Yeah.
But there was a deep, unresolvable philosophical contradiction embedded in the very foundation of Pullman's utopia.
What was that?
Well, George Pullman was not building this out of sheer philanthropy. He was a capitalist, first and last. He firmly stated that capital will not invest in sentiment for the laboring class.
Right.
He believed deeply that a person only values a thing if they pay for it. So he didn't give this beautiful housing away as a perk of the job.
We charged them rent.
He charged rent, and he calibrated that rent specifically to ensure a strict 6% return on the company's massive investment in building the town. He was the employer, the landlord, the grocer, and the utility provider.
And that monopoly over their lives created incredible friction. We actually have a clear window into how this was perceived at the time.
Oh, the Chicago Tribune piece.
Yes. The Chicago Tribune published an investigative piece in 1888 that laid out the workers' grievances. They wrote that there is, quote, variety and freedom on the outside, monotony and surveillance on the inside.
The workers felt entirely trapped by the restrictions.
Yeah, there was no path to property ownership, and they felt the company was essentially extorting them for rent, heat, gas, and water at inflated prices.
And the surveillance was subtle but incredibly pervasive. Company inspectors would randomly check homes for cleanliness. Saloons were strictly banned within town limits to ensure a sober, compliant workforce.
It was a pressure cooker of paternalistic control.
So much so that a significant portion of the workforce actually chose not to live in Pullman's perfect town.
They voluntarily moved out to the surrounding, much grittier, much dirtier neighborhoods, because out there, you could eventually buy a house, you could grab a beer after a 12-hour shift, and most importantly, you could escape the constant hovering presence of your boss when the whistle blew.
The psychological toll of living inside your factory was immense, and it all came to a devastating head around the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition.
Right, because Chicago was at the center of the global stage then.
Millions of visitors from all over the world flocked to the fair, and many took side trips to marvel at Pullman's immaculate town. To a casual tourist stepping off a train for an hour, it looked like a glowing, unprecedented success of American industry.
But the tourists didn't see the ledger books.
No, they completely missed the looming financial crisis. A severe economic panic hit the country in 1893. The railroads were vastly overbuilt, deeply mismanaged, and suddenly the lucrative orders for new Pullman luxury cars just dried up.
So the factory is facing a massive shortfall.
Exactly. So they aggressively slashed workers' wages to keep the company afloat. But here is the critical historical mechanism that caused the explosion.
The rent.
The rent. While the wages plummeted, the rents, which the company deducted directly from the workers' paychecks before they even saw the money, stayed exactly the same.
So the workers were left with absolute starvation wages. After rent was automatically extracted, a worker might take home pennies for a week of backbreaking labor.
And meanwhile, the corporate dividends paid out to Pullman's investors remained completely untouched.
That is brutal. So the financial buffer protecting the corporation and its shareholders was paid for directly by the sudden destitution of the workforce.
Exactly. Discontent could no longer remain silent under those conditions. The math of the utopia simply broke.
I have to push back a little on Pullman's core philosophy here, though. He claimed that capital shouldn't invest in sentiment for the laboring class. But wasn't his entire town a massive physical exercise in sentimentality?
How do you mean?
I mean, he built Romanesque arches, an artificial lake, and curvilinear parks. That isn't strict utilitarian capital. If he wanted pure efficiency, he would have built concrete block dormitories.
That's a fair point.
He wanted absolute control, but he desperately wanted it masquerading as benevolence. He wanted to be seen as a grandfather figure to his workers. But the moment the economy dipped, the benevolence completely vanished, and the rigid 6% return took absolute precedence. The utopia was only a utopia when times were booming.
That is a very sharp observation. The aesthetic was deeply sentimental, but the financial ledger driving it was entirely ruthless. When that ledger was threatened, the true captive nature of the arrangement was exposed.
Yeah, it was a trap.
The town was a beautifully decorated cage, and the workers only fully realized the bars were there the moment the door locked on their wages. And that, of course, led to one of the most famous and destructive labor strikes in American history.
Okay, so we have these opulent, beautifully crafted Pullman cars rolling across a newly connected continent, carrying wealthy passengers in total luxury.
But there is a massive technological contradiction happening on the rails themselves.
Exactly, because pulling these rolling palaces of mahogany and brass was a machine that was dirty, gritty, and incredibly inefficient. I'm talking about the steam locomotive.
The friction of distance and comfort were solved, but now they face the friction of inefficiency.
Right. To make railroads truly viable for the 20th century, the very heart of the machine had to change.
And the transition from steam to diesel power is one of the most vital yet underappreciated technological leaps in industrial history. We tend to deeply romanticize steam trains today, the white smoke billowing over the mountains, the whistle. But from an engineering and logistical standpoint, steam had to die.
It was just a terrible technology for the scale of work required.
Exactly.
Why was it so bad, though? I mean, when you stand next to a massive steam locomotive, they look and sound unbelievably powerful.
Oh, they produce a lot of power, sure, but their thermal efficiency was abysmal. A steam locomotive operated at a maximum thermal efficiency of maybe 6 to 10%.
Wait, 6%? That means if you burn 100 pounds of coal, 94 pounds of it are doing absolutely nothing to move the train forward.
Precisely.
Yeah.
More than 90% of the energy generated by burning that coal was just wasted, as heat radiating off the boiler and thick smoke going straight out the smokestack.
That's incredible.
Right. Compare that to early diesel engines, which were quickly hitting 36% thermal efficiency. You're getting immensely more work out of every drop of fuel.
It's a massive difference. But it wasn't just the fuel efficiency, right?
No, the logistical footprint required to keep a steam locomotive running was a waking nightmare. They required massive amounts of water and coal at regular, frequent intervals along the entire route. You needed water towers and coaling stations everywhere.
And starting them up must have been a process.
Oh, if you wanted to start a steam train from cold, you couldn't just turn a key. It took hours of labor to build a fire, heat thousands of gallons of water, and build enough pressure to move. And when it came to maintenance, there was almost no standardization.
Because they were essentially hand-built.
Exactly. Spare parts were often cast from unique wooden master casts kept in a specific rail yard for specific locomotives. If a side rod or a valve broke out on the line, you couldn't just order a replacement part from a catalog. A machinist had to custom fabricate a repair job for that exact engine.
It's basically an artisanal, bespoke machine trying to do industrial-scale punishing work.
That's a great way to put it.
It really reminds me of keeping a giant, incredibly needy digital pet alive, like a 100-ton Tamagotchi.
A Tamagotchi, that's hilarious but accurate.
Right. With a steam locomotive, you have to constantly feed it water and coal, even when it is just parked in the yard doing nothing. If you let the fire go out in the middle of winter, the water inside freezes, expands, and completely cracks the boiler, destroying the engine.
Yeah, that happens.
And if you let the water get too low while the fire is hot, the boiler catastrophically explodes. You have to constantly tend to it, pay a crew to watch it, whether it is actively earning money for the railroad or not.
That is exactly what the reality was like. And the railroad executives knew this was an unsustainable financial drain. The seeds for the alternative began brewing back in 1898 when Rudolf Diesel patented his compression ignition engine.
Okay, so the late 1800s.
Yeah. Now, early on, there were some clumsy, highly experimental attempts with internal combustion on rails. A man named William Dent Priestman tested an oil engine back in 1888. The Swiss and Germans had some functional, low-power rail cars running by 1914. But there was a primary, immense engineering hurdle keeping diesel out of the heavy mainline freight business.
What was stopping them from just dropping a big diesel engine into a train?
Two things. First, the power-to-weight ratio. Early diesel engines were massive, heady cast iron blocks that didn't produce enough horsepower relative to their own massive weight.
Okay.
But more importantly, the mechanical transmission was a severe bottleneck. If you want to take a massive diesel engine and mechanically link it directly to the wheels of a train to pull thousands of tons of dead weight from a dead stop, you need a clutch.
Right, just like a manual transmission in a car, you have to slowly engage the spinning engine to the stationary wheels.
Yes, but a mechanical friction clutch, capable of handling the sheer, violent amount of torque required to move a freight train, would have to be incredibly large. It physically could not fit within the standard 8-foot 2-inch width of a North American locomotive frame.
And even if you could fit it.
Even if you could somehow fit it, the friction plates would burn up and wear out almost instantly under the immense strain.
So you have this powerful, efficient new engine, but absolutely no way to connect it to the wheels without tearing the machine apart. How did they actually solve it?
The breakthrough came in the United States, largely through the massive research and development budget of General Motors.
GM.
Yeah. GM acquired the Winton Engine Company, which at the time specialized in large marine and stationary diesel engines. Supported by GM's resources, they developed the Winton 201A in 1934.
1934.
It was a two-stroke, mechanically aspirated, uniflow scavenged, unit-injected diesel engine.
Okay, hold on. Let's break that down. Uniflow scavenged, two-stroke. Why does that specific design solve the power-to-weight ratio problem you just mentioned?
It's all about how often the engine makes power. In a standard four-stroke engine, a piston only delivers power on every fourth movement. But in a two-stroke engine, it delivers a power stroke every single time the piston goes down.
So it's doing twice the work.
Exactly. And uniflow scavenged means they forced fresh air in through the bottom of the cylinder and pushed the exhaust out the top in one continuous flow. By firing twice as often and breathing much more efficiently, this engine produced massive horsepower while remaining incredibly light and compact.
It was finally the right size for high-speed mobile use.
And they followed that up in 1938 with the legendary Model 567 engine, which was designed specifically to handle the extreme, vibrating rigors of locomotive freight service.
And this is when the famous streamliners hit the tracks, right? the mid-1930s.
Yes, exactly.
The Burlington Zephyr, the Union Pacific streamliners, these were custom-built, lightweight, articulated trains that looked like silver bullets shooting across the landscape.
They were gorgeous.
It absolutely shattered schedule times because they didn't have to stop for water every 50 miles. But the real death knell for steam wasn't just how fast they looked, it was the maintenance ledger.
The money.
Always the money. By 1939, Electromotive Corporation, which later became EMD, took their FT demonstrator freight locomotive on a massive national tour. They proved definitively that a diesel locomotive needed almost no maintenance between its mandatory 30-day inspections. You just fueled it, checked the oil and water, and kept it running 24 hours a day.
It was a complete paradigm shift. If steam was a needy Tamagotchi that constantly demanded attention, the diesel locomotive was like switching to a modern smartphone.
Turnkey.
It was a turnkey operation.
Yeah.
You push a button, it fires up, you turn the switch, it completely shuts down and stops consuming fuel.
And the parts were standardized?
Highly standardized and mass-produced on an assembly line. So if a cylinder head cracked, you didn't need a blacksmith. You just unbolted it, grabbed a replacement off a shelf, and swapped it in a few hours. The railroads quickly realized that diesel locomotives were available for revenue-earning labor 3 or 4 times more often than equivalent steam locomotives.
It is an incredible financial upgrade. But wait, I have to go back to that mechanical clutch problem you brought up.
Yes.
You explicitly said standard clutches would burn up under the torque and they wouldn't fit in the frame. If that's true, how does the Winton engine actually move the train? What is connecting the diesel engine to the steel wheels?
Here is where the engineering gets wonderfully elegant. In a standard diesel locomotive, what we accurately call a diesel electric, there is absolutely no mechanical connection between the diesel engine and the wheels. None at all.
Wait, so the diesel engine isn't turning a drive shaft that turns an axle?
Not at all. The massive diesel engine, which is called the prime mover, does only one thing. It sits in the middle of the locomotive and spins a massive electrical generator, or in modern trains, an alternator.
Oh, I see.
That generator creates direct or alternating current electricity. That heavy electrical current is then sent down through thick cables to electric traction motors that are mounted directly on the axles of the wheels. The diesel engine is just a highly efficient rolling power plant.
That is mind-blowing. It's essentially a fully electric train that is just carrying its own power station on its back instead of getting power from a wire.
Exactly.
But how does the driver, the engineer, control that? If you're standing in the cab and you rev the diesel engine, does the train just shoot forward out of control?
It easily could, and that was a huge problem early on in the development. If you send too much raw electrical amperage to the traction motors at very low speeds, the motors can't turn fast enough to handle the energy.
They just fry.
You will literally melt the copper windings inside the motors. You will completely destroy them in seconds.
So how did they fix it?
The elegant solution came back in 1914 from a General Electric engineer named Herman Lemp. He patented a control system that flawlessly coordinated the engine's speed and the generator's electrical output using just a single lever.
The throttle.
Yes. In North America, the locomotive throttle has exactly 8 notches of power. In the UK, it often has 10. But let's look at the standard 8-notch system. When the engineer pulls that throttle handle, it sends a binary electrical signal to a governor. Moving it from notch 1 to notch 8 gradually increases the fuel injected into the diesel engine, which raises the RPMs. But at the exact same time, it tells the electrical control system to increase the excitation of the generator's magnetic field.
Which means it allows the generator to produce more electricity.
Exactly. The system balances the mechanical power and the electrical power perfectly in the background, ensuring the traction motors get the absolute maximum torque at startup without overloading and melting.
And the physical reality of that startup force is staggering. When you look at the engineering specs, modern units can develop 120,000 pounds force of continuous tractive effort.
To put that abstract number in perspective, that is roughly 30% of the locomotive's entire loaded weight, translated directly into pure pulling force at the point where the steel wheel touches the steel rail.
Just a tiny contact patch.
The physics of that contact patch, which is no bigger than a dime on each wheel, transferring that much energy without just spinning helplessly is incredible.
It's so much pure force that it goes right back to the violent reality we opened with. If an inexperienced engineer applies too much power too quickly while starting a massive heavy train on a grade, they can pull so hard that they rip the steel couplers, the knuckles holding the train cars together, right out of their sockets.
Jerking along.
Yes, jerking along. It paints such a vivid picture of the sheer terrifying forces at play here.
It is an immense amount of stored energy.
Yeah.
And what's truly brilliant about the diesel-electric architecture is that you can use that exact same electrical circuitry to stop the train safely. It's called dynamic braking.
Wait, if you're taking thousands of tons of freight down a steep mountain grade, standard mechanical friction brakes against the wheels would just get white hot and melt, right?
Absolutely.
So how do they stop? Are they running the traction motors in reverse to create some kind of electromagnetic drag?
That is exactly what they're doing. Remember that electric traction motors and electric generators are essentially the exact same machine, just operating in reverse.
Oh.
A motor uses electricity to create motion. A generator uses motion to create electricity.
Okay.
When a heavy train is going down a steep mountain grade, the engineer can pull a lever to switch the traction circuits. The forward momentum of the train forces the wheels to physically turn the traction motors. By changing the circuitry, those motors are converted into generators.
Ah, I see.
They start producing massive amounts of electricity, and the sheer effort of generating that electricity creates immense magnetic drag on the axles, which smoothly slows the train down.
But where does all that generated electricity go? You can't just pump it back into a battery on a 1950s freight train. They didn't have batteries big enough to hold that kind of juice.
No, they didn't. You route all of that generated electricity up into a massive grid of resistors located in the roof of the locomotive. The electrical energy is forced through these resistors and converted directly into heat.
Just like a giant toaster.
Exactly like a giant toaster. Large fans, which are conveniently powered by that exact same electricity you are generating, blow outside air rapidly across the grids to dissipate the heat safely into the atmosphere. You are taking the dangerous kinetic energy of a runaway train and turning it into harmless hot air blowing out the roof. It completely saves the mechanical friction brakes from overheating and failing on long, dangerous descents.
That is just brilliant, self-contained engineering. But it's interesting because looking at the historical record, diesel-electric wasn't the only way they tried to solve this transmission problem. There are some bizarre evolutionary oddities that tried to compete, like diesel-hydraulic locomotives.
Yes, diesel hydraulic took a completely different, highly mechanical path. Instead of spinning a generator to make electricity, the diesel engine turns a massive fluid torque converter connected to fixed gearboxes.
So it's basically a car transmission.
It operates very similarly to the automatic transmission in your car, just scaled up for massive industrial use.
Why on earth would you use that complicated mechanical setup instead of the elegant electric wires?
Well, before modern computers and slip control sensors, diesel hydraulics actually had a distinct major advantage in raw traction. In a standard diesel-electric, every axle has its own independent motor. If one wheel hits a slippery patch of track covered in oil or wet leaves, that specific motor will instantly spin wildly out of control, losing all its traction and power. But in a diesel hydraulic, like the famous German ML4000s or the models used extensively in the harsh winters of Finland, all the axles on a bogie are physically linked together by solid mechanical drive shafts. If one wheel tries to slip on ice, the other wheels physically hold it in check. You got much better, consistent grip per unit of weight in terrible weather.
That makes a lot of sense in a pre-digital era. There are also some highly specialized locomotive configurations that evolved for very specific niches, like the cow-calf setup.
Oh, those are fascinating.
It's a fascinating visual. It's a pair of locomotives permanently coupled together and used primarily in massive hump yards where they sort freight cars. One unit, the car, has a cab where the engineer sits and controls everything.
And the calf.
The second unit, the calf, has a massive diesel engine and traction motors, but it has absolutely no cab, no windows, no seats. It's just a raw slave unit providing extra muscle, completely controlled by the electronics in the cow.
It was an incredibly pragmatic, cost-saving evolution. You double your raw pulling power without having to pay for a second cab, a second set of complex control interfaces, and a second crew that you simply didn't need for slow yard work.
And then you have the flame-proof diesels. I had no idea these things even existed.
They're very rare.
They were heavily utilized in highly volatile environments like oil refineries and military ammunition dumps. Obviously, you can't have a steam engine spitting hot red coals and sparks in an ammo dump.
No, that would be bad.
But even standard diesels were considered far too risky because of exhaust sparks. So they engineered these highly specialized units with massive water-filled exhaust boxes to instantly quench any red-hot carbon particles before they left the stack. And the entire electrical system was completely insulated and enclosed in heavy metal housings to prevent any stray arcs. The machine completely adapts to survive the specific niche environment.
Exactly. The industrial organism mutates to survive the constraints of its habitat.
But all this deep dive into the brilliance of diesel electrics raises a huge, painfully obvious question for me.
Okay, let's hear it.
If a diesel electric locomotive is basically just a rolling power plant generating electricity to run electric motors on the wheels, why didn't we just string up electric wires everywhere and skip the diesel fuel entirely? It seems like hauling around thousands of gallons of explosive fuel and a massive diesel engine is just an unnecessary, heavy middleman.
It's an excellent question, and it comes down entirely to capital costs and the sheer friction of geography again.
The geography strikes again.
Always. Stringing overhead electric wires, what we call catenary lines, or laying an electrified third rail is unbelievably expensive. It requires building stationary power plants, countless substations to step the voltage down, and constantly maintaining thousands of miles of high-voltage wire exposed to the elements.
So if you have a dense, high-traffic area, like a commuter line between New York and Washington, D.C., where a train runs every 10 minutes, the massive initial investment pays off through cheaper operating costs.
Yes. In dense urban corridors or in heavily trafficked, compact European rail networks, full electrification is highly economical and efficient. But in North America or the vast Australian outback, you have thousands of miles of rural track traversing empty deserts and mountains with very low traffic density.
Right, running a freight train through the desert once or twice a day absolutely does not justify the multi-billion-dollar capital cost of stringing and maintaining electric wires for 1,000 miles.
The self-contained flexibility of the diesel-electric locomotive was the perfect economic compromise. You get the incredible pulling efficiency of an electric drive, but you carry your own power infrastructure with you.
Which perfectly brings us to the modern era and the final invisible friction, the environmental reckoning of all this, because there's a deep, tragic irony here.
It really is.
When diesel first replaced steam in the 1940s and 50s, it was hailed as this incredibly clean, modern alternative. No more massive clouds of thick black coal soot blanketing cities and choking people. But today, we realize that diesel has a massive, largely invisible environmental and public health cost.
It does, and the empirical data is quite stark. For decades, the rail industry and regulators assumed that diesel locomotives were relatively clean compared to the millions of trucks on the highway. But modern studies eventually revealed that the standard calculations for locomotive fuel consumption and emissions were heavily flawed.
How so?
Because they operate at such extreme power levels, diesel locomotives actually release massive amounts of nitrogen oxides, which are a primary dangerous cause of urban smog and environmental acid rain, along with very fine particulate matter, commonly known as soot.
Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, the Chicago Tribune actually sent investigative reporters and scientists into these operating locomotives with air monitors, and what they found was terrifying.
Oh, the soot levels were off the charts.
They measured the ambient soot levels inside the cabs of locomotives leaving the Chicago rail yards and found they were frequently hundreds of times higher than the pollution levels found on the busy city streets right outside. The projections show that without severe federal intervention, U.S. diesel locomotives would be releasing nearly 800,000 tons of nitrogen oxide and 25,000 tons of deadly soot every single year.
And that constitutes a severe public health crisis, particularly for marginalized neighborhoods that are often situated directly adjacent to massive rail yards where these engines sit idling 24 hours a day.
So how is the organism mutating to survive this environmental friction? The EPA finally stepped in with Tier 2 standards, which mandated slashing allowable soot by 90% and nitrogen oxides by 80%. But how do you actually achieve that mechanically when a freight train still requires 4,000 horsepower to move?
You have to completely rethink the architecture of the power plant. One highly effective modern solution is the genset locomotive. Yes. Historically, a switching locomotive had one massive medium-speed diesel engine that guzzled fuel and spewed emissions, even when it was just idling in the yard waiting for work. A genset locomotive throws that out. Instead of one massive engine, it uses multiple, smaller, incredibly high-speed diesel engines, essentially highly advanced, clean-burning truck engines mounted on a single frame.
Oh, that makes sense.
A central computer constantly monitors the exact power demand. If the engineer is just moving 2 empty cars, only one small engine turns on. If they suddenly need to pull 50 heavy cars, a second or third engine instantly fires up to provide the required voltage. It drastically cuts emissions and fuel use by only burning exactly what is needed at that exact second.
And then there are the green goats. I just love that name.
Green goats, yeah.
These are hybrid switching locomotives used in yards. They completely flip the ratio. They use a very small, ultra-clean diesel engine paired with a massive, heavy bank of rechargeable batteries. For the constant stop-and-go, pushing and pulling work of a busy rail yard, the batteries provide all the immediate traction power to the motors.
Right. The tiny diesel engine just hums along quietly at a constant, efficient speed, purely to keep the batteries topped up. It almost entirely eliminates the toxic emissions during idle time in city centers.
It's exactly the same fundamental engineering principle as a hybrid consumer car, just scaled up to move thousands of tons of steel. But cleaning up the engines and their exhaust is really only half of the modern evolutionary story.
Right, because the tracks themselves are changing.
The massive iron rails themselves are fundamentally changing. The invisible, complex systems that guide these massive machines safely across the continent are being completely digitized.
The friction of capacity. This is the final piece of the puzzle. We have these incredibly powerful, cleaner machines, but they're still running on steel tracks that essentially haven't changed their basic physical form in over a century.
Yeah, rails are still rails. If you look at what Network Rail has been doing over in the UK, specifically looking at their massive infrastructure upgrade in Birmingham, you get a clear glimpse into how the track itself is evolving. They are actively shifting away from old mechanical semaphore signals to 64 new ultra-bright LED color light signals, which are much easier for train drivers to see in thick fog or blinding rain. But much more importantly, they are installing 60 digital axle counters.
The transition to axle counters is the crucial invisible technological leap here. Historically, railways used what are called track circuits to prevent trains from colliding. They would run a low-voltage electrical current continuously through a section of the steel rails, which is called a block.
Okay.
When a massive steel train entered that block, its metal wheels and axles would short-circuit the current, and that broken circuit would trigger a red light behind it, telling the next train to stop.
It's a very clever mechanical system, but it has a massive flaw, right? It relies entirely on the physical electrical conductivity between the wheel and the rail. So if the rail gets covered in wet autumn leaves or heavy rust from disuse or even certain types of water, the electrical current won't short out.
Yes.
The system will falsely report that the track is completely empty and you risk a catastrophic rear-end collision.
Exactly. The old track circuits were inherently prone to environmental failure. An axle counter, however, completely removes that risk because it is a definitive digital sensor. It is clamped directly to the rail. As a train physically passes over it, the sensor electromagnetically counts the exact number of steel axles entering a specific section of track.
So it's counting each set of wheels.
If a train with 30 axles rolls in, the system registers 40 axles inside the block. When the train leaves that section miles down the line, another digital sensor counts the axles going out.
So if 40 axles go in and 40 axles go out, the computer knows with absolute certainty that the track is empty. But if 40 go in and only 36 come out, it knows a piece of the train uncoupled and is still sitting in the dark in that block.
Precisely. It tells the signalers exactly where the trains are on the network with absolute digital certainty, immune to leaves, rust, or weather.
And the why, the reason they are spending millions to do this, is pure capacity. When you know exactly where every single train is and you can trust that digital data implicitly, you can safely run trains much closer together. You massively increase the carrying capacity of the entire network, you reduce frustrating journey times for passengers, and you do all of it without having to buy land and lay a single expensive inch of new track. You are literally upgrading the software of the railway rather than the physical hardware.
All software now.
I find it so incredibly poetic, though. When you read about the Birmingham installation, they mention that while they are installing this cutting-edge fiber optic digital tracking tech out on the rails, all of those precise digital signals are still physically being routed through the original grade the second listed Birmingham New Street power signal box located on Brunel Street.
That is cool.
It's this perfect, tangible blend of the historical 19th century brick-and-mortar railway housing the invisible digital future of the 21st century.
It perfectly proves the point that infrastructure doesn't just bulldoze and replace the old with the new. It organically builds on top of it, layer by layer, mutating to fit the new reality.
What an absolute epic journey today. Let's recap what we've unpacked. We started with the sheer grueling physical labor of the Transcontinental Railroad, where mapping the unknown and laying 1,900 miles of track by hand physically shrank a continent, eliminated the friction of distance, and permanently altered the economy of the American West.
We did.
We saw how George Pullman took that raw track and layered incredible luxury on top of it, solving the friction of comfort, but inadvertently proving that a heavily surveilled, meticulously designed capitalist company town is prone to catastrophic, volatile failure the moment the financial weather turns cold.
The gilded cage.
We popped the hood on the engines themselves, watching the needy, highly inefficient steam beasts die out to make way for the standardized, brilliant diesel-electric powerhouses that essentially function as rolling electric power plants using Herman Lemp's throttle control.
And finally, we explored how the environmental toll of those diesels is forcing the creation of battery hybrids and gensets, while the tracks themselves evolve a digital nervous system of axle counters to pack more trains into the exact same space safely. If we connect all of this mechanical and historical evolution back to the bigger picture of how you live today, it raises a really fascinating thought for you to take away.
Think back to George Pullman's company town for a moment.
Right, the Romanesque arches and the indoor plumbing. Exactly. He provided beautiful, curated architecture, supplied comfortable housing, state-of-the-art indoor plumbing, and manicured parks. But he inextricably paired it with subtle, constant surveillance and a total intentional blurring of the line between a worker's labor and their private life. His ultimate goal was to maximize industrial efficiency and retain highly skilled labor by completely controlling their physical environment. Now, look closely at today's massive, sprawling tech company campuses in Silicon Valley and beyond.
Oh, wow, I see where you're going with this.
They offer their employees free gourmet cafeterias, private Wi-Fi-enabled commuter buses, on-site sleeping pods, state-of-the-art gyms, and even free laundry and dry cleaning services. Are we, in a very real way, just reinventing the Pullman company town for the digital age?
That's a huge question.
The architecture might be sweeping glass and steel instead of Romanesque brick, but the underlying mechanism of control is remarkably similar. Keep the highly skilled worker on the campus, seamlessly blend their life and their labor so they never want to leave, and provide incredible amenities in exchange for their total, undivided dedication to the corporation. And the critical question becomes, if the financial weather turns, if the modern tech bubble bursts the exact same way the railroad bubble burst in 1893, will modern tech workers suddenly find themselves caught in the exact same captive trap as the railway workers of Pullman's utopia?
That is a genuinely chilling parallel. The aesthetic changes, the technology evolves, but human nature and the strict demands of capital might not change at all. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you walk away looking at the tracks, the trains, and maybe even your own office campus just a little differently today. Keep questioning the infrastructure that moves your world. We'll see you next time.
And that brings another quiet episode of Sleepcast to an end. Thank you for spending this time with us. We hope our two hosts helped you relax, slow your thoughts, and perhaps drift gently off to sleep. New episodes of Sleepcast are released every day, 7 days a week, all year round. Follow Sleepcast on the podcast app you are using now, so new episodes are added automatically, and you can be notified whenever another wonderfully boring story is released. Until next time, sleep peacefully and good night. Sleepcast, probably the most boring podcast in the world.